castle. His birth, the result of magic and subterfuge. The epic of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table is a tale of passion and noble deeds, love and chivalry. It's also a tale of death and destruction, suffering and war. Above all, it's a tragedy. The story of a king losing his queen and finally his kingdom. The tales of King Arthur are based on scraps of history, facts, and folklore. They have endured over the centuries and have been fashioned by history, modified and extended.
All cultures have figures who represent the kind of sum of everything that is thought to be good. Arthur is a very human hero. He represents what is best of the human battle leader. He then represents what is best of the Christian knight. He then represents what is best of the Victorian Christian. And now he represents what is best of this sort of New Age mystic.
For years, historians and archaeologists have long investigated and debated whether or not there was a real King Arthur.
I don't believe in King Arthur, a medieval king, charging around on horseback, organising knights, looking for the Holy Grail. That won't do in historical terms.
I suppose there's a probability that somebody of that name existed and the myth started from there. What I'd really say, though, is it's not very important. You know, if some hairy Celt did exist, you know, bog-trotting around in the distant past, well, that's quite interesting. But what we do know exists is a myth.
There is a certain amount of data that suggests a historical context for Arthur, but none of it actually points to a person named Arthur or a specific person. So it's very difficult to say that a historical Arthur existed, or even that someone existed who later became Arthur.
Accounts of Arthur's exploits, real or fictitious, were largely passed on by word of mouth for 500 years. Then, in the 12th century, several accounts of Arthur's life were written, and more importantly, embellished. The spread of these medieval versions of the tales were phenomenal, and the life of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table became a classic romantic narrative.
It all began a very long time ago, a time when bravery, chivalry, and loyalty were celebrated above all qualities, and love and passion held court. Uther Pendragon was King of England. He was a much-loved king and had brought peace and prosperity to his realm. Uther had two problems. First, he had no male children. Second, he had a consuming passion for Igraine, the Duke of Tintagel's wife. The king was desperate to see Igraine and summoned her and her husband to his court, but they refused to attend. Uther despaired and summoned Merlin. Merlin agreed to help, but only on one condition, that any child conceived as a result of the union between Igraine and Uther would be given into his care. It was agreed, and Merlin wove his spell. A terrible battle was fought. The Duke was killed, and Uther took Igraine. 9 months later, a baby boy was born, and Uther was forced to keep his promise to Merlin. Igraine, against her will, was forced to hand the child over. Merlin told her it was for the boy's own safety, but Igraine never forgave him. The boy, of course, was Arthur, Uther's son, and he was destined to be king of all England.
The great turning point in the story of Arthur is 1066, the year of the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest of England. Ultimately, it was this single but momentous event in history that was to create the legends of Arthur. Tales of Arthur, written partly as a justification of the conquest and partly as a reflection of the new society, captured the imagination of the aristocracy across Europe. This was reflected in the first and wildly successful book dealing with Arthur, The History of the Kings of Britain, by Geoffrey of Monmouth.
The history of the kings of Britain seems to have caught on immediately, presumably because it was so new and people found the idea of Arthur as a medieval monarch so exciting. It was soon the source for various French versions of the Arthur story, and there are a lot of manuscripts of it. There's an enormous number of manuscripts for a book from the 12th century in quite difficult Latin. It was a real bestseller of its period, the first Arthurian bestseller, perhaps. There weren't many adventures of knights in Geoffrey. He didn't write about love and chivalry. He just wrote about medieval warfare, but it was the grandeur of his Arthur that people liked and that they imitated later and followed up in many ways.
Apart from Arthur's military successes and the idea of a medieval monarch, Geoffrey also incorporated the Welsh poet Mervyn into his story, calling him Merlin. He was a wizard, the greatest wizard of his time, known for his marvelous powers. Legend credits him with many amazing feats, transforming himself into different creatures and foreseeing the future.
Merlin is the name that Geoffrey of Monmouth gives him, and it's the name that he sort of continues with to the present day. He is a type of magician. We know him from other cultures. Very, very commonly, you get a powerful figure who protects a young king. Arthur, as a baby, is quite helpless. He needs Merlin to look after him. Merlin, with his prophetic powers, can see into the future, knows what is in store for Arthur. He can arrange the future. But what is interesting about Merlin is that his power is vast, but it's very unspecific.
Merlin's fate is as mysterious as his life. For once Arthur had married Guinevere, Merlin disappeared. He felt his work was done. Some believe that Nimue, Lady of the Lake, shut him up in a cave, and his ghost still haunts the bottom of the caves at Tintagel.
Uther did not survive the birth of his son by long, and the kingdom soon fell into chaos. Finally, the Archbishop of London appealed to Merlin for help. A king had to be found to restore order. Using his magic powers, Merlin devised a plan to unite the country and bring peace to the people. A summons was sent to all great men of England to come to Westminster. Here, the next king would be chosen. There, in a churchyard, stood a large stone with a steel anvil set in it. Out of the anvil rose a beautiful sword. An inscription on the stone read, "Whoever draws this sword is the rightful King of England." Among the crowd were Arthur and his brother Kay. Kay was the first to try to pull the sword from the stone, but it did not move. Then, without fear, Arthur strode up in front of the crowd and drew the sword cleanly from the stone. The crowd cheered, and Arthur was proclaimed the King of England.
By completing a quest, Arthur became King of England and acquired his court, Camelot. However, he was to be provided by magical means with another sword more appropriate to a king, and he also needed a queen, Guinevere, the love of his life. In the late 12th century, a number of French writers take up the story of Arthur. By far the most important of these is Chrétien de Troyes. Writing under the patronage of Countess Marie, daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Marie had inherited a taste for literature, and the ideal of courtly love flourished in her circle.
The Arthurian stories as we know them developed, particularly in the hands of a great French writer called Chrétien de Troyes, working in the late 12th century, 1170s, 1180s. And he inserted what we call the single hero adventure, the stories of knights, Sir Lancelot, Sir Ewain, and so on. And he put them into the framework that Geoffrey had left us. Arthur has a grand court with a round table, and the knights leave one by one, and we follow them. Whereas Geoffrey gave us the political model of the Arthurian world, Chrétien gives us the heroic individual model. And there are many exciting semi-magical stories, drawing on Celtic mystery, but also providing models of courtesy, chivalry, courtly love, and noble deeds. And it's from there, really, that our idea of heroes, knightly heroes, come.
There was this idea of the chivalric conduct of the knight, the fact that you were, in a way, a member of a very elite group, and your fellow knights had to be regarded and had to be treated in a certain way. Infidels, of course, are outside the group. You could treat them in whatever way you liked, usually as violently and as brutally as possible. But the knight himself really had joined a club, and it was that club that was what was important for knighthood and for the survival of the knightly, chivalric code of ethics.
Chrétien de Troyes also conveyed to his audience senses of values. We get the idea of the value of courtesy, that it's good for men not to be just beastly warriors killing each other, but to behave well to each other in an orderly, graceful manner. And this is all in very beautiful, graceful poetry. So there's a civilized element to it. There's also the question of behaving well to women, which is very much a new idea in the Arthurian story, and the idea of courtly love of a lady honouring a woman.
Part of the chivalric code was that as a knight, you did have a relationship with a lady. The lady, in a way, had an almost mystical significance, almost akin to your relationship with God. You looked up to her, you did her bidding, you were her servant. At the same time, the lady herself had a certain amount of power. She could spurn your advances, or she could accept them.
Returning victorious from a hard-fought battle, Arthur was determined to attend the celebration feast at a local castle. Merlin tried to persuade Arthur to head back to Camelot, but Arthur was insistent. That night, as Arthur lay back in his bed, he heard a harp echoing through the castle. Drawn as if by a magnet, he went through the hall and the courtyard to find a woman sitting alone in a room. She was the most beautiful woman Arthur had ever seen. He loved her at once. Merlin, who had followed, ever mindful of Arthur, touched his shoulder and told Arthur her name. "That is Guinevere," he said. "Merlin," Arthur whispered, "that is the woman I shall marry." Merlin tried to dissuade him. "Forget her. There are many other fish in the sea," he said. "Not for me," replied Arthur. Merlin spoke bitterly. "Marry her, and you will bring yourself nothing but misery. Marry her, and it will spell your ruin and the ruin of your kingdom."
Arthur was a knight, and like all knights, he now needed the ultimate protection, a sword, the most important symbol of knighthood and a knight's most vital possession.
The sword was the most important weapon of the knight, and he wore his own personal sword when he was dismounted. He would have an arming sword, which is the sword he'd wear on horseback, often longer in the blade to give him extra reach. It was no coincidence that it was a simple cruciform sword, and that, of course, conjured up the religious elements. The idea of the cross. Religion did play a part in the ideals of knighthood. And the cross hilt of one's sword also perhaps reminded one of an allegiance to God, as well as to one's fellow knight and to the ideals of the chivalric code.
Needless to say, heroes, fighting heroes, have to have swords. And Arthur actually has two swords, two very important ones. One of them he pulls out of the stone. And this is the sword that signifies that Arthur was meant to be king. The second is the famous Excalibur. Now, this sword, according to the later tradition, is given to him by a supernatural being, by the Lady of the Lake.
Merlin recognized that Arthur's determination to marry Guinevere was too strong, but he was afraid for Arthur. "So be it," said Merlin. "Marry her if you will, but you'll need another sword for protection." The next day, Merlin took Arthur to a lake. "Arthur," he said, "this lake separates life from death. Beyond the mists is the island of Avalon. Those who have lived there are not living, neither are they dead. They have unearthly powers, powers for good and evil. As the moon cast its light upon the water, a hand rose above the surface, holding a beautiful, glistening sword. Arthur took the sword and its superb silver scabbard. The sword and the scabbard were held by the enchantress Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. The name of the sword is Excalibur. Excalibur will bring you victory and glory. It will cut through iron and steel. But the real power lies in the scabbard. Whoever wears the scabbard will never die of his wounds. Remember, Arthur, never be parted from it. Guard it with your life.
Danger in the tales comes in many forms. The quests themselves, which prove the prowess of the knights, the strange beasts they fight, the injuries received in a violent society. But for the nobility, there was also the danger from within, the fear that your own family could turn against you in the struggle for power.
Mordred, very ancient figure. Of course, the name Mordred sounds like the French word mort for death, but he's a Welsh figure, Medrawd. He's there from the very, very beginning. He's the son that Arthur has, who is fathered in some wrong way on Arthur's sister, on Arthur's half-sister, on the witch Morgause or Morgan, and he is the sort of the Freudian son who returns to kill the father. It's hard not to read him in this modern way, though of course in medieval times he is also the member of your family who is going to take his sword to you to get your throne. So he's a sort of the malign figure in your household or kingdom.
Shortly after meeting Guinevere, Arthur was at home in his castle. He was alone and lonely. A woman arrived seeking shelter. Arthur immediately liked her, and that evening, despite his love for Guinevere, Arthur stayed with her. The next morning, she had gone. It was not until much later that he was to learn the foolishness of his action. On his wedding day, Arthur woke early and met Merlin standing on the castle ramparts, looking apprehensively at a group of riders approaching the causeway. Merlin said, "There are your 3 half-sisters, the daughters of Igraine by her marriage to her first husband. 2 of them have come to make their peace with you, but the 3rd, Morgan Le Fay, is evil. Indeed, I had hoped never to see her in Camelot." As he looked, Arthur saw that Morgan Le Fay also had a boy with her. "Who is the child?" Arthur asked. "You do not want to know, especially on your wedding day," said Merlin. As Arthur looked down at the riders, he was filled with a terrible sense of foreboding and demanded that Merlin tell him who the child was. "He is your son. He is called Mordred. His mother is Morgause. She came to you that night. She was sent to seduce you by Morgan Le Fay. Mordred is the weapon she will use against you. He is your Judas. He will betray you."
King Arthur was to be betrayed, but not only by Mordred. Arthur established the Round Table with the help of his greatest friend, Lancelot du Lac, who was also to inflict on Arthur his greatest agony. The Tales of Arthur began to incorporate the idea of individual knights, and the story of Arthur's life became synonymous with his Knights of the Round Table. Over the course of the Middle Ages, the fighting knight steadily grew in importance. Knights were employed by the nobility, working for the person who would pay them the most. Their relationship was two-way. They received a payment and consequently owed the lord their loyalty. The lord relied on their allegiance for his power. Knights did not like to feel they were competing for privileges from the noblemen. So the Round Table cleverly introduced the idea of equality between honorable men.
One of the most notable features that arrives in the development of Arthurian story is the Round Table. But it figures very strongly. Every Arthurian romance begins with them all sitting round the Round Table. Now, this is a symbol of equality among the knights, and even King Arthur too. And so it's a valuable symbol. It's also a symbol of completeness, a magic circle. This is what they are. They are an entity of brothers around the table, and when one knight is missing or killed, the circle is incomplete. There's magic in the Round Table as well as a sort of democratic politics.
Arthur and Guinevere were married, and after the blessing, Guinevere's father led Arthur away into the great hall of Camelot. In the middle of it was an enormous round table. Guinevere's father proudly presented his gift. Arthur was delighted, for he had become concerned that his knights were too conscious of their position at court, and this would be the perfect solution. "Here at the table," said Merlin, "will sit all those great men who will help you build up your kingdom. Some are here already, and you will find their names written in gold on their seats. Others will come later. But there is one place reserved, the Siege Perilous. If any man but one sits there, it will be the death of him. Only one knight may ever take that place, on the day the Holy Grail comes to Camelot. He will be the last to come, and he will be the best of you all."
The Round Table has proved to be one of the most enduring images of the Arthur stories. In Winchester, there is an ancient table, a monument to this medieval fascination with Arthur. Around the very edge of the table, you have the 24 names of the knights, including famous ones such as Sir Galahad, Sir Lancelot du Lac, and of course, Mordred. Although Arthur is an undeniably British hero, there is still much debate about where exactly his court and realm were. After the stories of Arthur were first written, it was Somerset in the southwest of England that made the greatest claim for the site of his court, Camelot.
Camelot is the name we use for Arthur's court, but it really seems to be used in French romances without any very clear sense of where it was. It's caught on for us as a mysterious name, a sort of a nowhere that is of great importance. Avalon, the place where Arthur goes to heal his wound, sometimes a place where the Lady of the Lake is to be found, is often identified with Glastonbury, which is a fairly sort of mysterious place surrounded by flooded land or waters. It's thought to go back to the Celtic word aval for apple. The Isle of Apples is referred to in some Celtic material. And it's almost like another world in some sort of way.
Glastonbury, an ancient and mysterious town in Somerset, has become the area most frequently associated with King Arthur. Just a few miles away at Cadbury, there is an important Iron Age fort, considered by many to be the most likely site for Camelot. And in the town of Glastonbury itself, Arthur's grave was supposedly discovered at the Abbey. It is in Glastonbury that the story of Arthur and the early history of Christianity have fused together.
Glastonbury Tor, the centre, the focal point of the Isle of Avalon. Here, obviously an island, because, well, the levels in front of us, the levels all around us, are in fact well below sea level, and as you can see at the moment, somewhat in flood. And then looking towards Dorset, towards the south, South Cadbury Camp, the Iron Age hill fortress which John Leland, Henry VIII's antiquary, called Camelot. "Here be Camelot," he said, and Arthur resorted much hither. And not very long afterwards, somebody else wrote about it, that it was the place where Lancelot often visited.
Guinevere and Arthur remained childless. As his queen, Guinevere gave Arthur every happiness he could wish for. Camelot flourished as never before. Knights flocked to offer their services to the king, for they were determined to rid the land of evil. They were happy times. A badly wounded knight arrived at Camelot, telling Arthur he could only be healed by the best and bravest knight. Although Arthur's knights all tried, none of them could heal the injured knight. Very shortly after, the Lady Nimue arrived with a handsome young man. She told Arthur, "He is called Lancelot du Lac. Merlin brought him to me as a boy and asked me to care for him, telling me that I should prepare him to become your bravest knight." Arthur at once knew how to test this claim. He instructed Lancelot to heal the injured knight. "But he is not yet a knight," said Nimue. "Make him a knight, Arthur, and Lancelot will do as you ask." With that, Arthur took Excalibur, and with a light tap, Lancelot was knighted. Lancelot then rushed to the dying knight and healed him. In the following weeks and months, Lancelot, Guinevere, and Arthur were hardly out of each other's company. They were close, but almost as suddenly as he appeared, Lancelot disappeared.
The figure of Lancelot is something of a latecomer to the Arthurian legend. He's introduced by Chrétien de Troyes in the Middle Ages. Previous to that, there was a Welsh companion, Bedivere, who was the companion to Arthur. There is certainly a school of thought that feels that this new figure introduced a completely different set of values. He is something of a French lounge lizard. He is extremely handsome. The ladies love him. He is a threat to Arthur, quite literally, with his association with Guinevere.
Years passed, and then a knight appeared. It was Lancelot, but he had changed. He had become thin and aged. For months, Lancelot had traveled aimlessly. He came upon the castle of King Pelles at Corbenic, where they had been plagued by a great fiery dragon. Lancelot fought the dragon. His great skill and courage had not left him, and it was slain. A feast was held, and King Pelles thanked Lancelot for his deed, saying that he would see something now that no other knight had ever seen. Lancelot told Arthur, "With these eyes I saw the cup Lord Jesus Christ drank from at the Last Supper. King Pelles told me that the cup was passed down to him through his forebear, Joseph of Arimathea." Arthur dismissed the vision as trickery and illusion, but Lancelot maintained he had seen the Grail.
Probably the best well-known object in the Arthurian legend is the Holy Grail. And it's an amazing object because although everyone knows vaguely what it is, there's actually, within the tradition itself, no clear idea. Sometimes it's called a stone, sometimes it's called a platter, sometimes it's called a chalice. Later tradition associates it with the cup of the Last Supper, the cup from which Christ drank at the Last Supper, but also very often the cup which contained his blood on the cross. So it's a double link to Christianity.
Lancelot then revealed to Arthur that he had a love, but one that he was ashamed of, for she was another man's wife. He told Arthur that during his time away, he had stayed with Elaine, the daughter of King Pelles at Corbenic. She had borne him a son, Galahad. Lancelot had been attracted to Elaine because she had reminded him of his true love, Arthur's wife, Guinevere. Arthur could not bear to hear this, but Lancelot begged Arthur to hear him out. "At Corbenic, I was in misery, for in my heart I was with Guinevere. One day I awoke and felt sick with the lies and dishonor and ran away." As Lancelot finished his story, they were urgently summoned to the river, where a large barge was coming in towards the bank. On it lay the body of a dead woman. "It is her. It is Elaine," said Lancelot.
Lancelot is a very human figure. He's not the perfect knight. If you think of all of the knights of the Round Table, there's only one out of all of them who is actually pure at heart. And that, of course, is Galahad. And Lancelot, who is the knight that everybody wants to be, is not actually pure of heart at all. And he doesn't just pursue an adulterous love, but he pursues that love, you know, with the queen, who he should really owe some sort of allegiance to, above and beyond his own base desires.
Galahad, the son of Sir Lancelot and the scorned Elaine, was to prove himself more than worthy of his place at the Round Table. Only he is able to fulfill the quest for the Holy Grail. The greatest adventure attempted by Arthur's knights was to see the chalice with the blood of Christ. This was the ultimate prize. Many knights were killed in their adventures and others returned empty-handed. Lancelot found the Grail but was denied sight of it because of his adultery, whereas Galahad, who was able to fulfill the quest, becomes the greatest and most honorable knight that ever lived.
The Grail can only be possessed by the purest knight. And indeed, it is only Galahad, in the end, who can see it.
With Lancelot now back in Camelot, Arthur's knights now set out to find the Holy Grail. But many knights were killed in their adventures, and others returned empty-handed. One day, as the court gathered, an old man entered the hall with a young companion. The young man was led to the Round Table by his partner, who then lifted the golden cloth that covered the Siege Perilous, the place reserved at the table on pain of death for the perfect knight. Beneath the cloth, it now read, "This is the seat of Galahad, the perfect knight." Galahad, the son of Lancelot and Elaine, had come to take his place at Camelot. That evening, Arthur knighted Galahad, and a strange and dazzling vision appeared, a glimpse of the Holy Grail of legend.
The Arthurian story grows remarkably and rapidly. For example, Lancelot is the character who brings in the ethos of courtesy. Gawain, that sort of lusty warrior from Celtic, is demoted, and Lancelot is suddenly the greatest knight. But then there's another greater knight, because when the Grail story comes into the tradition, Sir Galahad becomes the Grail achiever.
Many knights tried and failed to find the Holy Grail. Eventually, it was the fate of Galahad to fulfill the quest. After traveling for many months, Galahad and his companions, Sir Percival and Sir Bors, arrived at Corbenic, the castle of King Pelles, the Fisher King. Inside the castle, the three men found King Pelles. To Galahad he said, "I am your grandfather. Elaine, your mother, was my daughter." He took from behind his couch a sword that was broken in 3 pieces. It was only when Sir Galahad held all 3 pieces that the sword became whole again. It was a sign. A brilliant beam of light shone in the room, casting light on a strange event, the Grail procession. 3 maidens walked through the hall, and each bore a precious object before her. A cup of silver, a candlestick with 7 burning candles, and a spear covered with blood. The 3 companions saw marvels beyond compare. The Holy Grail was handed to Galahad, and Jesus Christ appeared. Sir Bors was the only one of the 3 knights who returned to Camelot to tell Arthur and his knights of the Round Table what had occurred. For at Corbenic, Sir Percival found his true love and remained with her. And Galahad, having seen the Grail, died shortly after. For he, the perfect and blameless knight, the Grail Knight, chose to forego life so that he could remain pure after his vision of the Grail and Christ.
From here, nestling behind Chalice Hill, is the town. Chalice Hill is so called because of the tradition that Joseph of Arimathea came bearing the cup of the Last Supper, the chalice, and it is here buried. In support of that tradition, of course, is that this is the source of water for the abbey, and the spring itself, or at least the wellhead in the spring itself, has a brown or red mark around it. And those who are very fond of this particular tradition, which itself is only about 100 years old, say that this proves the tradition.
We argue these days that the Grail story emerges because of certain specific historical events. In 1187, the Western forces lost the Holy Land. They were defeated by Saladin, the knights were massacred, and Jerusalem was taken by storm. And whereas for 100 or so years the West had felt it owned the holy places, you know, they were lords of Jerusalem, all of a sudden this underpinning of the faith was removed. And very remarkably, the Grail stories seem to have emerged. In the Grail story, you go on a quest for the Grail, eventually the best knight will find it, and it represents a sort of the perfect communion. This is the chalice in which Christ's blood was caught as he hung on the cross. It is found somewhere in Western Europe, Glastonbury or wherever, and somehow this is an imaginative displacement for the West of their loss of the holy places.
The loss of the Holy Lands was now strongly featured in the stories of Arthur. With Galahad dead, Lancelot potentially was once again the greatest knight. But he was only human. He betrays Arthur's trust. It is Lancelot's relationship with Guinevere that is to prove pivotal to the final showdown. Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur is the most complete history of Arthur. After its publication, the popularity of these stories slowly declined. In the 19th century, there was an upsurge of interest in the Middle Ages. Tennyson published a series of epic poems known as the Idylls of the King, and King Arthur was re-established as a favorite heroic figure.
Malory, Sir Thomas Malory, is the English author that most people who read and speak English know as the major Arthurian writer. Malory wrote in the later 15th century. He'd finished his great Le Morte d'Arthur by 1471, and it must have taken him quite a time to write. Malory is the sort of the gathering of earlier material into English and the source for material in English later on. Malory is really it. Malory's book is usually called Le Morte d'Arthur because that's what Caxton called it when he printed it. You know, it's a great title, The Death of Arthur.
Now that Galahad was dead, Lancelot was again the greatest knight. But he avoided the queen as much as possible, and in anger, she sent him away. The seasons came and went. One night, Mordred, Arthur's son by his half-sister Morgause, arrived to tell Arthur that they had found Lancelot. He was nearby, and he was not alone. For Guinevere had also found him. She had been spending her days in his company. Mordred reminded Arthur, "The law says that adulterers should be burned at the stake. The queen must die, my lord, and so must Lancelot." Arthur reluctantly agreed, for he now knew that Guinevere had been lying to him. A trap was set. The next day, Guinevere, once again telling Arthur she was going out riding, went to meet Lancelot. Mordred and his men followed her. Lancelot escaped, but Guinevere was captured. She was tied to the stake, and the torches were lit, ready to set the pyre aflame. All of a sudden, Lancelot and his men came galloping from nowhere. He hacked at the ropes binding Guinevere, freeing her, and together they rode off. The lovers were soon found at Lancelot's castle in Wales. For months, Arthur's men laid siege to it. Many were killed, though neither side was victorious. Finally, after the dead were piled around and all were exhausted, it was agreed that Lancelot would go into exile in France, and Guinevere would return to Camelot with Arthur. Still dissatisfied and angry, Arthur decided to pursue Lancelot to France, leaving Mordred in charge. But soon, Arthur heard the news he dreaded. In his absence, Mordred had pronounced himself king and was claiming Guinevere as his queen. Arthur returned to Britain to save his kingdom. In a dream, Arthur was advised not to fight Mordred immediately, but to wait until reinforcements came. So Arthur sent a message of truce into Mordred's camp, and they met to discuss terms. During their talks, one of Mordred's men was bitten by an adder, and he drew his sword to kill it. When the two armies saw the light flashing on the drawn sword, a great shout arose on either side, and the final battle began. All day the battle raged, and by nightfall, Arthur and his faithful knight Sir Bedivere were the only knights left standing. Seeing Mordred, Arthur snatched up a spear and rushed towards him. In his haste, Excalibur and the magic scabbard slipped from his saddle as he drove his spear through his son's hateful heart. Mordred's sword cleaved Arthur's skull apart, and he lay dying. In his dying moments, Arthur asked Sir Bedivere to throw Excalibur back into the lake whence it came. The brave Arthur's body was borne from the battlefield. At the lakeside, out of the white mist came a barge, and in it were many fair ladies, all veiled in black. They carefully placed Arthur in the barge, and it moved off into the mist towards the Isle of Avalon. King Arthur was never seen again, but the belief endures that one day, in its hour of greatest need, Arthur, the once and future king, will return from Avalon to save the Kingdom of Britain.
Ultimately, the Arthur story is a triangle story. You know, it's the story that is, we still watch on our television screens in all forms, that this is a triangle story about a king. And a kingdom collapses. It's not just a marriage, not just some disturbed children. Indeed, there are no children. But this is the end of civilization as we know it because of sexual passion. This is a simple story and a big story.
The Arthurian legend has a number of very strong patterned features that seem to stay no matter what happens. One is the hero himself, the fact that he comes out of mysterious circumstances. His birth is unusual in some extent. He rises to power in a kind of power vacuum. He demonstrates his perfectness for the job by pulling the sword out of the stone in the later text. He leads the whole of the society, the whole of his group, successfully in battle. But also I think it's part of human expectation that perfection is something we can't sustain for a long time. And Arthur, the hero, then disappears. He dies, he sleeps, he goes into the West.